This week on Beyond Well Science, we're going to talk more about open dialogue with Dr. Christopher Gordon. Dr. Gordon has served as medical director of Advocates since 1995, and he's the medical director and senior vice president of clinical services. Is that the right order to present those two titles, Chris?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And actually, I just retired from Advocates after 25 years. I retired 2 weeks ago. So now I'm the Chief Medical Officer Emeritus.
Oh my gosh. Well, congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you.
I'm hoping you're going to actually get to spend more time on your hobbies.
Yeah, that's the plan.
I was really impressed by your vita when you're on the faculty of Harvard Medical School and associate professor of psychiatry. And then I'm thinking, here's a person who was probably brought up in a very traditional way of psychiatry. What led you to discover and be so passionate about open dialogue?
Well, when I became a psychiatrist, which goes back about 45 years, psychiatry was, in a lot of ways, a different enterprise. There was a lot of tension in the field then between different paradigms of understanding people. And psychoanalysis was still quite vibrant. Psychodynamic psychotherapy based on psychoanalytic principles was vibrant. And as were other more existential perspectives on human suffering, in contrast to the biological model, which was becoming more and more ascendant in the 1970s, but hadn't yet become completely dominant as it has in more recent time. So I went into psychiatry because I was fascinated by people and what made people tick, and did not have a sense that psychiatry was basically neurology light, but rather it had to do with people's suffering and their trying to make sense of their lives. So that's always been my orientation. And although I was trained at Mass General and have been on the faculty there ever since my residency, and Mass General is a more biologically oriented institution, there has always seemed to be a place for me and others who take a more, we might say, more nuanced view of human, the dilemma of human unhappiness.
Yeah, it's interesting because in many ways what you're describing is just a return to the whole person.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. I was saying to a colleague early last week that I think that when most people encounter open dialogue, they have a sort of aha experience of being reunited with an old friend.
Oh.
It's not so actually novel as it is more sort of Back to the Future, in a sense of going back to some basic ideas that the field has gotten away from.
It's fascinating. I was just in the hospital with my daughter, and we were talking about how dissected the health system has become, where it's, 20 specialists and nobody's talking to one another, and you never really see a doctor. And remembering that time when wellness was about you having a relationship with your doctor and them kind of guiding you through self-discovery to how to get well.
Yes. And the field has become horribly fragmented and extremely industrialized. But it's funny, really good doctoring is the same as it always was. I saw my primary care doctor yesterday. He spent 45 or 50 minutes with me, and it was a wonderful experience of just one person being with another, he having expertise that I valued, but he respecting my perspective about my own body and my own health. I don't think the problem is that medicine itself is bad or psychiatry itself is bad, but the industrialized versions of medicine and psychiatry are really pretty awful.
It's a fascinating concept, Chris, to believe that just as we each hold the capacity to heal ourselves physically, that we also hold the capacity to heal ourselves mentally. And I think that especially current psychiatry has really done a great job of saying, actually, if you just take this pill, this is what's going to make you better. And it's really caused us to neglect this sort of whole health, whole recovery effort that you're describing.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I don't mean to split hairs with you, Sheila, but
I love splitting hairs.
but I don't think it's true, really, that we all have the capacity to heal ourselves. We have some of the conditions from which we suffer are mysterious and unknowable and even fatal. And the proper perspective, I think, for a physician in the face of these difficulties is one of humility and caution. And instead, what the field tends to broadcast is unwarranted certainty and overselling of treatments as solutions. Instead, I think sometimes it's best that we are with the person who has the difficulty with as much withness as we can manage, but without pretending like either we or they necessarily are going to be able to find an answer to this thing.
I love that. That hair splitting was a good one. Thank you.
Good.
I want to go back to where this approach has been really successful because it's been used so long and so practiced in such kind of a tightly controlled area, if you would. In 35 years in Western Lapland, Finland, they have had just incredible effects from using open dialogue. 75% of those people experiencing psychosis have been able to return to work. And I wondered if you extrapolate that to a bigger subset of people, if you have a wider system using it, are the efficacy rates as high?
Well, let's talk a little bit about this. I got interested in open dialogue about 10 years ago. And my pathway to getting involved is I don't know, it's kind of a story in itself. Because at Advocates, where I've been working for the last 25 years, one of our maxims really is to listen to the people whom we're serving and to respect their point of view and respect their strengths and respect their abilities. And about 10 years ago, one of the people we were supporting began coming to my office to complain about our services and to complain about me particularly and about my leadership. And he was a real thorn in my side. But among the things that he complained about was that we didn't know anything about Robert Whitaker and we didn't know anything about open dialogue. And it turns out that this person who was such a thorn in my side has become over time one of my sort of mentors, certainly one of my dearest friends. And it was his prodding that got us to be involved in open dialogue in the first place. So it's kind of a salutary beginning. But what happened was I read Robert Whitaker's first book, which is called Mad in America, and which is kind of an indictment of the cozy relationship between academic psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
And I was very touched by this book, and I wanted to write Whitaker a fan letter, which I did do. And when I did that, I found out he was a local guy in Cambridge, and I invited him to come out to Advocates to meet our peer specialist team, in particular one guy who's our leader of that team, a man named Keith Scott. And so Whitaker did, and it turned out to be a really productive meeting. It also turned out that the next week, Whitaker was going to be going to New York to meet with Jaakko Sekula, as well as with Mary Olson, who was Jaakko Sekula's primary U.S. collaborator. And Whitaker invited me to come down to New York to have breakfast with this trio. And as a result of that, I sort of fell in love and wound up going to Scandinavia the following summer to do some poking around and investigating of my own. the more I learned about open dialogue, the more the outcomes did seem literally incredible. Like, I couldn't believe them.
Wow.
And as I got to know the people who did the research and reported the research, I have been consistently impressed with their integrity, their sobriety, their seriousness. So I don't have any doubt that the outcomes that they're reporting are true. However, for the last 9 years, we've been trying to provide open dialogue services at Advocates, and our results, while good, have not been as supercalifragilisticexpialidocious as those reports from Western Finland. So it's a dilemma to me.
Well, I can imagine just culturally there's so many differences. I mean, if you think about how tightly knit that community is, how differently people are in their homes because they tend to stay and they're not so fragmented, that there's probably more social support. I mean, have you already investigated the reasons why it doesn't work
I
as
think
well?
You're pointing to a couple of very important differences. Other differences that I think are important are that in this very tightly defined region of northern Finland around the city of Tornio, everybody was served by a single hospital. Everybody was served by a single crisis team. Everybody had the same kind of health care. And the system was set up so that they could identify people who were having psychotic difficulties extremely early on in the course of their difficulty.
Yeah.
By contrast, the young people whom we've treated in our services at Advocates over the last 10 years have almost all started their treatment already elsewhere. That means that practically everybody, with a couple of exceptions, had already been started on antipsychotic medication by the time they came to see us.
Yeah.
Whereas in Western Lapland, about 50% of the people who presented with that dilemma were never given antipsychotic medicine in the first place. So it's hard to know, if we had been able to see people earlier, would our results have been different?
Yeah.
But as much as I passionately believe that the open dialogue model is great and it's the model I'd want for myself or a loved one, I still have some skepticism about its capacity to have as profound an impact on true psychosis as appears in the results from the Western Lapland studies.
You mentioned the work of Robert Whitaker and the indictment of the pharmaceutical industry and overprescribing and really hammering people with drugs to the point that they don't have any more options. But is there any tandem use of psychiatric drugs with open dialogue? Or
absolutely, I refer in our work. There are 7 fundamental principles of open dialogue, but we added an 8th, and the 8th one that we added was what we call gentle psychopharmacology, which basically means we want to try to use the lowest dose of the safest drug for the shortest time.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And the ideal dose is 0. But nonetheless, sometimes these medicines are incredibly helpful, even life-saving. And, I myself take a psychiatric medication and have found great benefit from it, in addition to the psychotherapy that I've received over the years, which I've also found incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So, I like to tell folks I'm both the hair club president and also a client.
That is an awesome quote. I really like it. I've heard someone say before that when it comes to a mental health crisis, try to use psychiatric drugs like a screwdriver instead of a chainsaw or something like that. And I thought, well, that's a beautiful way to think about it. But the hair club way might be even better analogy. So Chris, in retirement, you have the chance now to think a lot. And are you thinking about ways that our mental health system can be fixed, or what are you focusing on at this stage in your life and your career?
Well, it's still too new. It's just been a couple of weeks, and I'm just getting my sea legs.
Yeah.
But I'm very fortunate to have been on the teaching faculty at Mass General and MacLean and Harvard Medical School for many years, and I'm going to continue that role. I hope to bring some of the principles of open dialogue into my teaching, as I have done for years. And I hope to continue to nurture the open dialogue programs through advocates and other places as well.
You know what it occurs to me is it can't hurt, you know?
You certainly can't.
Right.
And what we found at Advocates was that it was possible to take structures that are already in place, in our case, a mobile emergency team and an outpatient clinic and other outpatient services, and imbue them with dialogic principles. And that's kind of the secret sauce, I feel, is being in real relationship with people. And one of the real roadblocks in modern medicine is what we kind of think of as the tyranny of time. That you have to do everything really fast, you have to see a lot of people, you have to give them a diagnosis, and it's very mischievous.
It's mischievous, not just for the person who's in crisis, but it's so mischievous for the family, because if they're told that the person is never going to recover because they have a mental health condition that has a low recovery rate, they tend to believe it, and then they give up.
Right.
And what open dialogue does is says, let's take some time to figure this out and sort of dance together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other thing is that open dialogue kind of developed in parallel with the peer movement. By the time now, peers and open dialogue are kind of merging. But for a long time, open dialogue was a little bit in isolation from the peer movement. And the peer movement is incredibly rich. And among its many gifts is the idea that there are many different pathways to recovery. So as long as there's life, there's hope.
I want to end on that note, Chris. It's been so wonderful to talk with you. Thank you again. Chris Gordon just retired from his incredible role at Medical Director and Senior Vice President of Clinical Services for Advocates. Thanks again, Chris. Really, really enjoyable to talk with you.
Oh, thank you, Sheila. A pleasure to talk to you.